أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فوض أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم هن لباس لكم وأنتم لباس لهن صدق الله العلي العظيم. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman, Salamun alaikum jamian wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Question: what is the key to marriage on the onset? What is the key to marriage success in the very beginning? Let's keep that question in the back of our mind, inshallah, we'll return to it. We've began a mini-series a couple of days ago on the topic of marriage, and we'll be concluding that mini-series, the third discussion today, inshallah. And we said that this discussion about marriage in Islam is one that culminates and brings together all the different pieces that we've been talking about. It's brought them all together and married them, so to speak, no pun intended, to bring spirituality, ethics, and philosophy all together in one as a practical example and also a worldview. At university and in college, many a times we have what's called a case study. And that case study is an example, a real world example of how we can implement the theory that we've learned. For example, when you go to business school, you get an MBA, for example. Many times you actually learn things, finance, accounting, economics, marketing, strategy, you name it. And eventually, then the question boils down to, well, how do I actually implement this in our lives? And that's where case studies come in, and you look at, for example, what happened and what is happening in a business. The same can be said, for example, in law school and many other disciplines. Analogously, we are looking at how we can look at Islamic philosophy and thinking from Islamic worldview, the ethics that Islam espouses, ultimately to get towards spirituality. And the best example, one of the best examples, is that of marriage. Because Islam has one worldview with respect to marriage that may be different to other worldviews that we've seen in the past. And it's important to know that as one considers the philosophy and the concept and the society of marriage and how important it is in our lives. Therefore, I want to look at a few things in the brief moments that we have together. Number one, according to Sayyid Hakim, Ali al-Hakim in his book, Social Affairs, which I highly recommend, he highlights that in order to first understand marriage and the philosophy of marriage, one must also understand what are other perspectives and what have other perspectives throughout history been on marriage. What have been the views of philosophers? What have been the views of secularists? What have been the views of others? So number one, I want to look at what have been the views of philosophers and other religions on the institution of marriage, number one. Then number two, I want to come to what does Islam say with respect to marriage and what our responsibility therein is. In this, we'll discuss, for example, what are some of the goals of marriage from the Islamic perspective, but also we'll look at what are some of the societal challenges that emerge, the cultural challenges that emerge with respect to marriage in society. What are those things that are causing societal challenges in our communities? And because of these societal cultural dynamics, why is it that many of our youth are suffering and not able to get married? Not for any religious reasons, but other reasons that we'll see and investigate in the moments to come. And finally, I'll give one very important solution that comes from science and psychology that you can implement practically in your life so that you can have a prosperous marriage in terms of not only wealth, inshallah, but also in terms of the fruitfulness, the love, the ethics, the affection for one another, inshallah, so that we can build a strong society. Therefore, having these three pillars, I begin with the first one. The first pillar that we look at is what have others said before Islam, or what have others outside of the fold of Islam said about the institution of marriage. So we would begin with Plato. As you know, the ancient philosophers began, or with many, but the main ones are Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the ones that are before Socrates are known as the pre-Socratics. Socrates, as you know, didn't write much. He didn't write anything, in fact, his students did, Plato and the likes. Plato argued with respect to marriage. Now, notice how different his worldview is and how the view of others changed based off of Plato. Plato argued that the goal of marriage was political or political economic or political economy. And that was that the role of marriage was to actually help make the state stronger. This was Plato's view. To the extent that Plato's view was so radical for its time that he argued that a family should have children, or people, two, a husband and a wife, should come together, have a child. When they have this child should be given to a nursery. When this child is given to a nursery, it should be raised by someone else. When asked what is the reason and the philosophy behind this, Plato argued that the affection and the love of the nucleus of the family, that is the father, the mother, the child, the immediate family, must be transferred to the state. It has to be moved to the political realm. Why? He said because if people love their children and they love their families more than they care about the state, it will cause a conflict of interest in the environment of the society. And what will happen as a result of this is that you will notice that the state won't be able to function properly. Therefore, you transfer the love, the affection, the care of the family nucleus towards the state. This was the view of Plato. As time progressed, Aristotle, who was a student of Plato, came after him. He argued and he disagreed with his teacher. He disagreed with Plato. He said, it's not that so easy, and Plato errs in thinking that you can transfer the love and affection of the nucleus family from the family to the state. It doesn't work like that. That's not how life works. That's not how the world works. Aristotle said, it's not that we have a state family or a family state. That is what Plato was striving for. Rather, he said we have a state of families. That is to say that the state that which we live in is made up of families. Families are the building blocks of the state. Therefore, we have to look at the interest of the family so that we can have a strong state. Not to say that we look after the interest of state and then as a byproduct, the family becomes a casualty of that. No, this was the view of Aristotle. Bear this in mind because this came back later. The next view was that of Christian philosophers on marriage. Christian philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas and others, they came forward and said that because the church had a particular stance with respect to marriage, many of them argued that the best case scenario is for someone to become a monastic, someone who does not marry at all, someone who becomes a monk, for example. That's the best case scenario. This is what they argued. But if one cannot, the next best thing would be to have a marriage which is monogamous, husband and wife. And then from that monogamous relationship, Thomas Aquinas and other Christian philosophers argued that there was an element of social dynamics. So keep this in mind. From the philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle, who said that marriage was an element of political economy, there was a shift with the Christian philosophers such as Aquinas and others to social dynamics. So there was a social dimension that arose, that what does marriage do? If you get married, a husband and wife, generally the positive of a marriage is that there is affection, love, children, procreation, and fidelity between the husband and wife. That is, they stay together, they have a relationship together, and this is beneficial and positive for society. I say this for a number of reasons. Notice, political economy on the first level, social dynamics. The political economy was not being discussed by the Christian philosophers. It didn't happen until Hegel came forward in the 1700s. When Hegel came forward, he merged the view of the political economy view of ancient philosophers as well as the social view of the Christian philosophers together. And when he merged these two views together, what he said was that now in our society, marriage has been reduced to a contract. He said marriage is not just a contract. Marriage is rather ethical love. Keep that word in mind, or that phrase in mind. Marriage is ethical love. So what Hegel did was he merged the dimensions of political economy with the social dimensions and made a comprehensive or a more comprehensive view of marriage. And he said that a husband or a wife, when they show ethical love and affection to their spouse, they learn how to act as a good member of society, and therefore they know how to act with their brother or sister in community.
Therefore, Hegel looked at the family structure as a microcosm of society at large. So he said that people need to know how to act in their families, be good husbands, be good wives, be good parents, and have a good marriage, a strong marriage, because not only Aristotle's view of the state is built on families, but also the view of Christian philosophers that one in a relationship should not just be seen as a contract or a product to be used and abused. Rather, it should be love, affection, and ethical love and affection at that. Between all the different views of philosophers throughout times, researchers and people who are experts in this field, philosophers, argue there are two commonalities. One is economic, that is the economic dimensions of marriage, and the other is procreation, that is to have children. Islam also has a worldview, coming to our second point of our lecture. Islam also has a worldview on this matter. What is Islam's worldview on this matter? And Sayyid Hakim, in his excellent book, Social Affairs, highlights this in the section of marriage very eloquently. He says the Islamic view on marriage is very different than what we're traditionally used to in a material realm or otherwise, or what the philosophers have argued, political, economic, or for example, that of social only. Those dimensions are there. But he says the pivotal element within Islam of marriage is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God Almighty, has said that marriage is one of my signs. Allahu Akbar. That Allah is saying that one of my signs, that is one of my landmarks, one of the roadmaps that shows you who I am, metaphorically, is marriage. One of the ways in which you see who I am as your creator, God is telling us, is through the institution of marriage. It's one of his signs. Allah has said that the sun is one of his signs, the moon is one of his signs, the earth is one of his signs. In it, constantly Allah is saying that in it are a sign for those who reflect. For example, the ancient philosophers, the likes of Socrates and Plato, would argue that in ancient times, that they argued that by all means one should become married. And when asked why, he said that if you get married, you'll get happiness, and it's a good marriage, you get happiness. And then if you don't get, it's not a good marriage, then you will at least become a philosopher. You will reflect on it at the most. He used the term men, but I'm sure our sisters would also argue that they've become philosophers in many processes as well in marriage. The point I'm driving at, Islam focuses on tafakkur and tadabbur, over 700 verses of the Quran. I mentioned this at the beginning of our conversation. Over 700 verses of the Quran allude to this fact that, that one should reflect, do tafakkur and tadabbur on their lives. And if one does do tafakkur and tadabbur, that means reflection and contemplation, they end up with better results. I mentioned this because I mentioned in the last lecture, Gottman said 67% of all marriage arguments are perpetual. They always keep happening. But if you reflect and pause and try to see things from the perspective of your spouse, or you try to see it from your perspective, what ends up happening as a result of that is you actually can reduce the amount of perpetual problems, and you can have a more loving, caring, affectionate relationship. And this is what Islam sought. Why is marriage a sign of Allah's from amongst his signs? Because it is, Allah says he's put mawadda wa rahma. He has put a reciprocal love and mercy between the hearts of husbands and wives. At least that's the theory. You may say that that's not always the case. Nonetheless, that's what Islam sought for. That marriage was supposed to be a dwelling, a libas. The Quran uses that phrase that I said at the beginning of the lecture. Hunna libasun lakum wa antum libasun lahunna. That they are a garment for you and you are a garment for them. That a garment covers. Therefore, in Islam, it is not only political, not only economic, not only social that marriage is there, but marriage is also there to fulfill the spiritual requirements of the husband and wife. The spiritual requirements being getting closer and in closer proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Having said this, I want to highlight what are some of the challenges that have emerged in our society because of culture and not necessarily because of religion. By the way, I'm not saying by any means that culture is completely all wrong. That would be like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. The reality of the matter is that there are certain elements of culture which put undue burden on our next generation and have caused many problems in terms of people getting married. One of them is delayed marriage in and of itself. Many times people are getting married after they have finished university, after they have gotten their job, been in their job for some time. And through that process, what ends up happening is through that process, you end up becoming fixated on who you are. Islam came forward and says to try to get married young as much as is possible. There is a scientific argument that may be made here. What is that? This front part of our brains, this is what is called the frontal lobe, or more specifically, I'm going to get at the prefrontal cortex. Why am I saying that? This is what allows us in particular to do much of our complicated cognitive abilities that we're able to do, such as mathematics, such as, for example, in-depth writing, analysis. Much of that stuff comes from here. I say this because research shows that this part of the brain is not fully developed until about 25 years. At the maximum, I see 28, even maximum 30. But beyond this age range of 25 to 30, what's happening is this prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe, is set in being. And in it being set in being, what ends up happening is you are sort of already, you're set for who you're going to be for the rest of your life. Now imagine if someone gets married after that. They go to pharmacy school, med school, for example, they go to engineering school, law school, then they graduate and they start working. When they start working, eventually, let's say they start getting married at 31, 32, 33, which is becoming common norm in many of our communities. Well, what happens as a result is when you go get married at that point in time, alhamdulillah, that's still good. It's better than not. But what I'm saying is what can end up happening there is each person is set in their own ways. And when you're set in your own ways, you may not be as flexible. When you get married in a state where you're younger, when your prefrontal cortex is still developing, you are still flexible, you're still mendable, you're still someone who can grow and actually change perspective. So for example, when you're younger, you may try to say that, oh, maybe I can change. You may not realize this, you may realize this. So for example, if your spouse says, maybe we can see things another way, the best thing that you can try to do is try to look at your spouse with rose-colored glasses. For all my young brothers and sisters who are interested in getting married, for those who are married and those who have some experience in the domain, a refresher. And also try to see things from their perspective. Try to see things from their worldview. So delaying marriage can have a cognitive impact because you're already set in your ways. And on top of that, I'm sorry to say, and I have to be frank here, what's happening in our communities is we're doing, and I mentioned this in London as well, and I'll repeat it here for our global audience. We're having marriages in our communities, Arab community, Iranian community, Persian community, Indo-Pak community, American, indigenous American community, around the globe. And what's happening is many times in our cultural dynamics, what we're doing is what's called marriages that are great on paper, but they're not really great in the realm of the heart. And what do I mean by that? The husband comes forward, or the groom to be comes forward, and he's pristine on paper. All the degrees you can think of, Ivy League, everything is perfect. In the old model, perhaps that worked, where, for example, the wife didn't work, or the wife wasn't. Now, as I mentioned in my previous lectures on the night of Lady Khadija, where I mentioned that women are going to college more, women are graduating more than men in the general population and in our communities as well. And so the dynamics are shifting. And so that guy who says, now I have a doctorate, for example, I work at this prestigious firm, consulting firm, law firm, banking firm, I have all of this and my way should go. Well, the sister's thinking, well, hold on a second. You have a degree from a prestigious institution. I have a degree from a prestigious institution. You've worked at this institution. I've worked at a prestigious institution. Everything that you have on paper, I have as well. So it becomes this tussle between two parties or two factions. One where one is beginning to say that I have all these material gains, but then the wife begins to say, well, I also have this as well. So what's your point? And so the argument becomes that, who has more? And the result of this is, the byproduct of this is that there's not harmony, and the two couples miss the forest for the tree, so to speak. They're just looking at one dimension of the equation. And in that process of trying to win the little battles, you lose the entire war. You have to win every little argument. And much better than that is you focus on the big picture of your marriage and reviving that and say that we're not married just because I have a degree or I have money or income. And I'm not married to you just because you have money or wealth or income. The Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam have clearly told us with respect to a man who looks for in his spouse wealth or good looks, attractiveness, will find that those same traits, if they have them, they may find after marriage that there are other traits that that person despises that emerge. That these things, wealth as well as looks, they are things that are fleeting. Our lives are fleeting, but especially these things will go. And I'm sure that this can also be applied the other way. The sisters, if the other way is going, because the dynamics are shifting. Now our women are graduating, alhamdulillah. It's a beautiful aspect. And also many times they may be earning more. You may realize that many of our challenges in society are political, economic, social challenges that are wrapped in the garb of religion. And many young people are having a difficult time differentiating between the two. The second element which Sayyid Hakim highlights is that of the increasing mahar or dowry, that they've gotten so extravagant that it's absolutely becoming out of norm. That if you look at our society, it's as if people are saying and giving a price to their daughter, that my daughter is worth 100,000 or 200,000 or whatever amount that is, and therefore if you do not pay it, you do not think that my daughter is worth much. You see what the problem with this is? I'll tell you exactly what the problem with this is. Because the dowry of the Lady of Light, Fatimah al-Zahra salamullahi alayha, was 500 dirham, which in today's time would be roughly 850 dirham. Are you and I saying, by virtue of that first statement, that the Lady of Light, Sayyidatun Nisa al-Alameen, her value was hasha lillah na'udhu billah min dhalik, 850 dirham in today's era? And on the flip side, are you and I saying that the value of a sister who, for example, gets a dowry of 100,000, is that her value? Is it not much more than that? We sometimes succumb to these frameworks that are not ours. By the way, there's been research that has been done looking at the size and the cost of wedding rings and wedding bands and the likelihood of divorce. And very clearly and categorically, people who have more expensive dowry rings for their weddings, and we're talking about 10,000 and up, they had a magnitude increase, almost 2 times more higher rate of divorce than people who had much cheaper, much affordable wedding rings. In fact, the ones that had the least likelihood of divorce were those people who had wedding rings that were less than $1,000. Why do I say this? I'm not saying don't have a nice wedding ring. What I'm arguing here is, what's the basis of the marriage? If the basis of the relationship is one of Islam, of love, of mutual love, respect, ethics, care, affection, then that wedding and that marriage will be strong in the good times and in the bad. In the ones where there are rocky times, stormy times, and I tell you, believe me with my hand on my heart, good times, they last, and good times, they don't last. Bad times last, and bad times don't last. Imam Ali al-Mu'mineen is attributed to have said, Al-Yawm Yawman, that there are 2 days. One day is for you, and another day is against you. One day things are going great, the next day they may be going terrible. One day things are going terrible, one day they're going great. How many people in the 2007, 2009 recession, they were flourishing right before it hit, and the real estate market, the financial markets tanked, millionaires went to zero overnight. You think that may be few and far between. I know people who in COVID-19, their graph in economics were skyrocketing. They were doing really, really well. And this COVID-19 hit and their economies crashed, their markets crashed, their businesses crashed, their livelihoods crashed. This is a terrible thing. I don't wish this upon anyone. But what I'm saying is, if you remember 2 nights ago when I mentioned that many of the arguments that families are having, and much of the reason that people are anticipating that divorces will rise in the wake of COVID-19 is because of financial arguments. Well, one should realize and support one another in these times, and not try to point fingers and criticize one another. But if the basis of marriage was, a sister is marrying a brother because he's very wealthy, or vice versa, the brother is marrying a sister because he's very wealthy, well, what happens if the wealth is removed from the equation? What happens if a recession hits? What happens if a depression hits? What happens if COVID-19 hits and all the money is gone? Do you still have a foundation for a strong relationship? Islam is very clear from this perspective of earning a halal livelihood. It's highly recommended. In fact, this idea that we should be living in poverty and austerity is not the goal of Islam. Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, he spent 25 years developing land and property so he could free slaves and make society better. This was the period after the death of Rasulullah and before his rise to become the leader of the Islamic world, at least apparently. In that period, we think sometimes he was just sitting at home. No, he was building society. And therefore, you and I must be very cognizant about where culture has crept in, and is this becoming a pet impediment for our communities and our societies? You know, much of the reason Sayyid Hakim highlights is the byproduct of this delayed marriage, of these high mahars, high dowries and the likes. You know, the result of much of this has become an environment where mental illness is increased, and he actually highlights this. And there's research that shows that for our younger audience, this hookup culture, for example, has led to increased levels of depression and anxiety. Why? Because people afterwards feel empty and depressed in the wake of that quick relationship, if you will. And I won't say more than that at this forum. What I'm saying here is we think that our modern society, in the direction it's leading us to, it will ultimately lead towards everything being better. And philosophers have argued about the bias of history. What is that bias of history? We think that that one slice of time in which we exist is the best slice of time, whereas there may be other times in history that were better, but we don't stop and reflect on that. Huxley, the writer, argued that the biggest lesson of history, perhaps, is that man does not take lessons from history. Imagine that. We don't learn from the pages of history, whereas many of the solutions are already there. Many of us feel empty inside. We feel like we're alone. And that happens when we don't value relationships. We take on materialistic avenues. I want to share quickly the story of Jawaybir. Jawaybir was a person who came into the fold of Islam. He didn't have much property. He didn't have much property gains. But at the same time, Rasulullah told him, Jawaybir, why don't you get married? At that point in time, Jawaybir said, Ya Rasulullah, I'm a convert, I'm not wealthy, I'm not educated, I'm not a scholar, I don't have anything that is appealing to someone in marriage. At that point in time, Rasulullah said, Jawaybir, go go to this family. At that time, Rasulullah said this to Jawaybir, and Jawaybir said, Ya Rasulullah, you want me to go to this prestigious family of Medina, one of these Medinite noble families, and ask for their daughter in marriage? He said, yes, I'm telling you. Tell him I sent you. Rasulullah told this to Jawaybir. Jawaybir goes towards the house. When he goes towards the house, he says, Salaamu alaikum. Alaikum assalam. He says, my name is Jawaybir. Wa alaikum assalam. How are you? He said, I have been sent by Rasulullah. He said, okay, what has Rasulullah said? And they're at a gathering there at this point in time. There's an entire gathering where it's in public, where this family has a delegation of friends and guests that are there. At that point in time, he says, who's the message from? He says, from Rasulullah. He says, shall I tell the message in private or shall I tell it here in public? At that point in time, Rasulullah says, or the man says, it's a message from the Holy Prophet, from Rasulullah. It's an honor for us. Tell me in public here, in front of everyone. That's fine. At that point in time, he says, Rasulullah has said that I am to marry your daughter. Imagine, at that point in time, when he says this, the color may have left the man's face, that you have no societal prestige. We are Medinites. We are people who have honor and prestige and dignity, have property, honor and nobility, and you, Rasulullah. At that point in time, he responds and he says, tell Rasulullah that we are Medinites and we are people of Medina, and we only marry our daughters to people who are from Medina as well, and from our tribes. Jawaybir said, I expected that anyways, very well. He turns around, he begins to leave. At that point in time, the people who are there saw this entire debacle in this scenario. The message reached the ear of the daughter of the chieftain. At that point in time, she said, what happened? That there was a man who came for a proposal. It came from Rasulullah. At that point in time, she said, so from Rasulullah, it must be good. There must be some benefit in it. At that point in time, he said that I must send a messenger to stop him at that point in time to intercept the messenger to stop Juwayber from sending the message himself. And so he did this and said that I will send the message to Rasulullah myself about this. So he sends Juwayber home. The next day, the chieftain goes to Rasulullah and says, Ya Rasulullah, salamu alaikum, wa alaikum assalam. He says, you sent a messenger to our house, an individual to our house for the proposal. He said, yes, I did. Juwayber, you met him? He said, yes. He said, Ya Rasulullah, you know that we only marry our tribes to our tribes. We don't marry outside. We don't marry people not from our town. You know this. Rasulullah says, why? What's wrong? He says, is he not a God-conscious person? Is he not a pious person? Is he not someone who has taqwa in his heart and mind and soul, in his being? And he's a person who's God-conscious. And he's a hardworking. He'll work hard. What's wrong with that? So, Ya Rasulullah, but customs and all that, Nonetheless, at that point, he took the message back to his daughter and she verified. He said, did Rasulullah really say this? The father said, yes, Rasulullah really said this. He said, if Rasulullah said it, must be good. It's verified from Rasulullah. If Rasulullah is giving a proposal, it must be the case. At that point in time, he said, very well. The same chieftain, his daughter agreed. He understood what Rasulullah had said, and he came forward and said, from this day forward, Juwayber is my son-in-law, and he's from me. Rasulullah didn't look at what income was there. He didn't look at what education was there. He wouldn't look at all of this. However, by the way, I'm not saying these are wrong. I'm just saying, what did Rasulullah look at? He said that, does this person have taqwa? Why? Because if someone has taqwa, God consciousness, spirituality, concern from their Lord, all of that should naturally follow. Enlightening themselves educationally, philosophically, ethically, spiritually, working hard to earn an income. All of that should be a byproduct of saying one thing: this is a God-conscious person with taqwa. And this is unfortunately one of the things that leaves many young people around the world disillusioned with religion. Why? Because someone is very, for example, outwardly religious. They pray, they fast, they have the long beard, for example, not to pick on anyone, but they have all of these outward indicators of faith. But inside, it seems that spirituality and that faith has not permeated through the heart. And so the softness isn't there. The love isn't there. The compassion isn't there. The affection isn't there. The care isn't there. The ethical love that Hegel said isn't there. And Islam said that all of that must be there as part of faith. How can it be that someone has deen, has religion, and at the same time is not a good, kind, compassionate person? How is it possible? A final narration, it's attributed that Rasulullah saw someone in the city of Medina who, in an alleyway of Medina, this person was shouting and belittling and beating his servant in the alleyway of Medina. When Rasulullah passed by and approached, the man turned towards Rasulullah and said, Ya Rasulullah, assalamu alaikum, how are you? I hope you're well. And he changed his entire demeanor. Rasulullah, it's attributed that he offered him a date, a fruit. He said, eat. It was Shahr Ramadan. The man said, Ya Rasulullah, it's Shahr Ramadan. It's the month of mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're all fasting. You know better than I that we're all fasting. I'm fasting. You're fasting. You're offering me a date in the daylight? Rasulullah is attributed to have said, your actions don't indicate that you're fasting. Because he was beating his servant, belittling and abusing his servant. He said, in this, it's much better that you eat a date and you quench your hunger so you're not hangry, by the way. The phenomenon that researchers have cited as one of the main causes of marital arguments is a phenomenon called hanger, a scientific phenomenon. That is anger induced by hunger. Rasulullah said at that point in time, don't miss the forest for the trees, as I'm saying in my terms. You're trying to think that I'm fasting, I'm all religious, but at the same time, I'm going to abuse someone and I'm still going to be someone of faith? How? It's a complete double standard. It's a complete different world. It's a complete missing of the concepts and the principles. Therefore, don't miss the forest for the trees. Understand that. So the final thing that I'm going to give you here is a piece of scientific advice. And the research from positive psychology in relationships, in marriages, for my younger brothers and sisters, those who are in their marriages in the middle term, and those who have been married for years. The most important finding from positive psychology may be that it's not the success of marriages that are determined. It's not how you deal with rocky circumstances. It's not how you deal with difficult circumstances that determines the success of the marriage as much as how you deal with the good times. How you tell when your spouse tells you, I got a promotion at work. When your spouse says, I accomplished my goal. When your spouse said, for example, that I recited the Quran today and I achieved some spiritual landmark. I received something from that. When your spouse tells you that I achieved this, how do you react to them? Are you positive? Do you turn towards them? Do you face them? Do you look them in the eye? And do you say, that is amazing? Or do you like continue on your work and say, oh, that's awesome. That's fantastic. Or do you say, oh, this is going to be a problem for us. This is going to be a headache. I don't have time for this. I mean, more income, that's going to be more taxes. Life's over. So researchers argue, which I highlighted a few nights ago, that there's a few ways you can respond. You can either be active or passive. This is one of the two options. And after that, you can either be constructive or destructive. So for example, a situation where someone is active, destructive. They face their spouse, engage with them, and say that this is going to be a disaster because our taxes are going to go up. You got a promotion, this is the worst thing that can happen. Actively engaged, and at the same time, you're being destructive. What's an example of something that's, for example, passive, for example, destructive? Passive destructive would be a situation where you say that you're on your laptop, they say, I got a promotion at work, I got some really good news at work, and you say that taxes are going to go up. I have to finish this work. And you just keep moving along. Passive, destructive. What's an example of something that's passive and also constructive? You're on your laptop, for example, you're doing your work and you say that, oh, that's great. That's so awesome. Congratulations. And then you keep going. This is how many people respond in relationships. And in fact, Martin Seligman, the founder, one of the main founders of positive psychology, he says when his wife came to him and said she got a promotion, this is how he responds. And that's how he used to respond. He would say, that's great, that's fantastic, I'm so glad to hear it. This was constructive, but it was passive, it was not engaging. The ideal solution, according to researchers in psychology, is what's called active constructive feedback or active constructive relationships, ACR. And in active constructive relationships, what you're saying is you stop what you're doing, you look towards your spouse, and you say, you got a promotion, that's fantastic. Tell me how that happened. What did your boss say? And then they tell you, for example, he said that you've been doing great, you'll be promoted, and I'm excited about this. Wow. They said, when did this happen? What time of day was it? Was it the beginning of the day, the middle of the day, the end of the day? When did this happen? So what you're doing is you're trying to help your spouse relive that positive emotion or that positive moment that was positive for them. And you're not getting to the point of saying that, for example, you realize that this is important to them. And if it's important to them, it should be important to you. And you want them to relive that memory. And so this goes right with the ethos of Rasulullah saying that a smile is charity, that a man must have affection for his spouse, a husband, a man, as Rasulullah is attributed to have said, a man who says, I love you to his wife will find that that statement will never leave her heart. You see, this is extremely important because there are different dynamics. Research is showing that has to come from the man, actually. Because the way that, according to Gottman, who I mentioned yesterday, the way that men react to women and the way that women react to men is very different in many respects. An example that Gottman gives. If a husband says to the wife, you're not listening to me, Gottman finds that the wife will stop everything and say, sorry, I got distracted. And she will turn her attention directly to the man and focus towards her husband. But at the same time, if the wife says to the husband, you're not listening to me, and this happens a lot, according to Gottman, the husband doesn't take it as seriously or doesn't get as focused many times. And that's a problem. And so there are these differences. Therefore, the culmination of everything. In Islam, the view of marriage is very different than material views and other world views that are materialistic in nature. The view of Islam with respect to marriage is that in Islam, marriage is one of the signs from amongst the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And someone who wants to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can try to understand a fraction of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's grandeur through understanding one of his signs. One of the signs is the sun, the moon, the earth, all of creation. Also, marriage is a sign. Having a good, fruitful, prosperous marriage is one way of understanding our Lord, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But before that, we have to inculcate love, compassion, affection, good ethics, good view of marriage, in the philosophy, good ethical traits in marriage, so that ultimately we can get towards spirituality in our lives, so we can have harmonious lives. I hope this has been a benefit to you, inshallah, and your families. And I pray that those who are not married, Allah grants them wonderful spouses to have wonderful relationships with. For those who are married, may Allah strengthen your relationships and your love and compassion between you even further, so that we can have strong families and give rise to strong children. وآخر الدعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. For our brothers and sisters on